get started with that. If you have any questions, feel free to interrupt. So I'll go over to Replit and go to my REPLs. So this is the new one, Tone plus P5. I'll put a link to this in the chat if you guys want to look at this or fork it for your own project. And let's see, so last time on Monday, we created a sampler. We added in a sample into our samples folder over here, and we mapped out our notes that we want to use. And then we also mapped out some key positions to visualize some keys. And then now we're using P5, so we use the preload function to load our sampler with our sampler parameters. And then we use our setup function to create our little canvas. And then in the draw function, we're just drawing a blue background. And then we have some events. So if we press a key, we're going to visualize a keyboard. So this is just an example. You guys can, do different things for the visuals. But that was just an example of how to visualize a little keyboard. I also have like kind of a couple of random visuals where we have like some random circles and some random rectangles. For the visuals, we're not really doing like a P5 thing, so I wouldn't worry too much about the visuals unless that's something that you're interested in working on more. But it's just good to have some visual to go along with the interaction so the user knows that their interaction is working. And then down here, so that's our visuals, the setup and the draw. Down here in our key pressed, that's where we're actually triggering our notes in our sampler. So this little if statement is checking to make sure that the key code of the key that we just pressed is actually one of our notes. And if that is the case, then we get the note from our key code map, and then we just play a sample. And it's just a quarter note. You could change the duration here. You could play multiple samples, but that basically gives us our little sampler. And so let's go ahead and run that and see where we're at. So I have my drum samples. And so I have one basic scale, just a C major scale that I can play with my drum samples. And then each one corresponds to a key. And then we also have these kind of like random circles and rectangles going on, but I'm actually going to move those to the other samples that I'm about to add. So that's what we did on Monday, and we're not going to do too much different. I'm going to kind of add another sampler in here. So you don't have to have multiple samplers, but you might want to have like different types of sounds that your user can play. So we just want to add in some different samples, and I'll also review how to get the samples into the project, and then we'll add some effects as well, which will be relatively easy. So yeah, let's just get started with that. So I'm going to add another sampler, but I don't want it to be pitched. So if you use the basic sampler in Tone, then the samplers are going to be pitched according to whatever key you play. So in this case, I'm choosing a note out of this scale of notes that we added. So there's, C4 through C5, just a major scale. And that's why the drums kind of sound like they're pitched. But if we don't want that, we can use a different audio player in Tone. So if I go to the Tone website and go to the API, we can see that inside of our instruments, there's the sampler, and all of these other instruments are synths. So they're going to synthesize sounds, which you can use as well. We used one in the first week of this project, and you can use a regular synth. You don't have to use samples. But if you want to play samples, what we want to use is actually just the player. This is how we can play just a single sample. So in this example here, it's going to play like a gong sample. And so if we want to do that, we can just use one player. But if we want to have multiple different samples that we can play, we can use a players um, object. And this one is a little bit tricky to use. I noticed that there isn't a lot of good documentation for this. So I'm going to go over how to get this to work. But it's a little bit tricky. It's a little bit different than what we see here. And then there don't seem to be very good examples for this. So let's make a couple of samples first, and then we'll add them into our project. Um, so another website that I like to use to generate sound is JFXer. So if I Google JFXer, this is just a website that you can generate sounds, and it's sort of geared towards creating sounds for games. So it's kind of small, but let's see if we can zoom in a little bit. You can see there's these like new sound categories, and some of the first two are just default and random, so it just kind of generates a normal sound. But then there's also categories that will generate sounds that sounds like pickup slash coin, laser slash shoot, explosion, power up, hit, hurt, jump, blip select. And what I love about this website is if I click these buttons multiple times, it generates different versions of this. So if I want different types of explosions, I can just keep clicking explosion, and it kind of generates these different sounds that sound like explosions. And then I can also play around with all the parameters that it uses to generate that sound. And I can even hit the mutate button to change the sound a little bit, but not completely. So I really love this website for making sound effects for games and projects and stuff like that. And so I won't spend a ton of time here because you can really spend a lot of time playing with all these different parameters and stuff. But I'll just go ahead and generate a couple sounds here. And if you guys like this stuff, you can spend a little bit more time exploring on this site. So I'll put a link to this in the voice chat, and I'll put it in the video as well. So let's just get a couple explosion sounds to play. So I'm going to click on explosion. Okay, that one's pretty good. Oh, that one's good. I want kind of a long one. So when I find a sound that I like, I can just click on the export button, and you can see it downloaded a sound file to my downloads folder. So I'm going to hit explosion again. That one's pretty good, and I'll export that one. So now I have a couple different explosions to play. So if you want to make a sampler that's not just playing like music, but some different sound effects. That's another thing that you could do with this project. So you might get some samples from this website or another website and add some graphics to go along with it. So yeah, I have a couple different explosions. So let's go back to Replit and I'll upload those. So I'm going to click on Replit. And so I downloaded those files to my downloads folder. So to get them into my project, I'm going to click on the Files tab and go to the three dots menu in Files and click Upload File. And we should see them here in my folder, my downloads folder. And if I shift and click both of them, I think I can add them at the same time. So now I have my two files. I'm going to throw those into my samples folder just to keep them organized. And I think the name of the file I don't necessarily need to change. No, I don't have to. So I have explosion 10 and explosion 11. That's fine for the naming. There is a space in there, which I usually don't like. I don't think it'll make a difference, but I usually like to replace spaces with underscores. I think that just works better in some cases. So we'll have explosion 10 and explosion 11. And so now let's add this into our project. And so one difference is that with our player than our sampler is that the player doesn't do this like base URL thing. It just takes multiple players. So essentially what's happening here, except we're going to add our URL as the parameter here. So let's create that. So I'm going to, after my sampler, I'm going to add a player, and inside my preload function, this is where I'm going to connect my player. So I'm going to say player gets new Tone.Players. And this is a bit of a, well, actually, let's call it players. Uh-oh. Oh, Replit is telling me that I'm out of sync. They look the same though. Let's see. Oh, okay. I think maybe the internet is just kind of slow. Um, So let's see, we have our sampler. Let's call this something else. Let's call this our sound effect. So I'm going to call this SFX. That'll make it a little bit easier to understand what this is. And then I'm going to say SFX equals new Tone.Players. And then for each one of these, basically, I'm just going to put in the URL, the full URL for where my explosion is. So I have to include the base URL plus the name of the explosion. It doesn't let me do this kind of like base URL property here. So I have my tone.players, and I need to give each one a name and then the URL. So what I want to do now is similar to what I did with my sampler params. I'm going to put the params up here. So I'm going to say constant SFX params. It doesn't really matter where you put this exactly, but I like to put it in the global scope so it's easier to find and edit. I don't have to go inside the preload function to find it. So my sound effects params are going to go into my tone.players. And then, of course, I can't forget to connect this to the destination. And so I'll save that. And so now let's add in our parameters. So we need a name for the sample we want to use, and then we need the URL to the sample. So for the first one, let's just call this explosion 1. And the URL for the sample is the same as the base URL. So let's copy that. And then we have to add in the name of the file at the end. So this is explosion, oops, explosion underscore 10.wave. And it doesn't matter that the name of the sample doesn't match the name of the file. So then we have explosion 2. And I'm just going to copy and paste the URL and add it down here and just change this to 11. So now we'll be able to add both of our explosions. So let's log our sound effects and take a look at it and just make sure it looks okay. And then we'll add it into our project. So let's run it again. And here we see our sound effects. So it's got some stuff in it. It looks okay. Let's look at this player's map. Oh, size is 0, so that's not good. Let's see if there's... that might not really matter. Let's see. So let's try, once we do the preload, let's try this in setup. So the way we play a sound is we say, with a players, we say sfx.player, and then we get the player that we want. So the player we want in this case is explosion1, and then we say dot start. So this basically gets a reference. So the players object has multiple players, and we have one player for each one of our samples. So we have explosion 1 and explosion 2. So we need to specify which player. So we say sound effects.player, and then give the name of the player we want. And then if we say dot start, this should play the player. And we should see if this works. If not, we may need to fix something. Okay, let's see. We're not getting an error, but it's not running. So let's take a look at this and see if we can see a more descriptive error. Oh, okay, we are getting a more descriptive error here. It says buffer is either not set or not loaded. So that means it doesn't know, it can't get this player. So let's look at our data again. I might have forgotten something. I wonder if I have to add in something like this, URL. Sometimes tone, the parameters change from just one player to multiple players. Let's see if this fixes our issue. So all I'm doing here is instead of just having a name and a URL, I'm adding a name and then the name has its own parameters, which is just a URL with the URL for the sample. Let's see if that one runs. Okay, that one didn't work either. I told you this one was a little bit tricky, so I'm gonna go look at my test example real quick, just so I can remember how this works. Okay, so let's look at our parameters. Okay, so it was how I thought it should be. Huh. So, hmm. Okay, so I was right on the syntax. Let's see if there's anything else I missed. No. Okay. Tone.Players. Da, 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 da. Okay. All right, I'm not sure why that is not loading the way we want it to. Maybe we can't start it yet because there's no event. So let's just put this inside of our key pressed and play our explosion. Maybe then it will work. Oh yeah, there. Okay. So I guess I just can't put anything in setup. It's not ready at that point. Okay. So that's how we play our explosion. That was explosion 1. And if I want to play explosion 2, I just change the name of the player. But I might want to play either one of the explosions. And right now I'm also not checking which key it is. So we're going to review how I check for the key by adding a new set of keys. So to create our melody, or not really a melody, but a scale, we use these notes. And so we're just mapping the key that we get from the keyboard to the note we want to play. So we can do a similar thing for our sound effects. So we can say constant, and let's call this sound effects keys. And so we're just going to use an object again to map the key that we want to play each explosion. So we have 2 explosions. So let's open keycode.info and let's use some keys that are near the keys that we already have. So I'll use Q and W, so 81 and 87. So the key is 81. This is the Q key. And for that one, let's play explosion 1. And the 87 key will play explosion 2. And that is the W key. So now now we have this nice little map of the key to the sample that we want to play. And so down here, we can do the exact same code on our key pressed. So we can say if SFX keys at key code. So this checks to make sure that the key code that we just pressed is actually inside of our keys. And then let's move this SFX.player back in here, and let's format that. And so now we just need to grab which sample we want to play. So we can say constant, whoops, sample equals sfx keys at key code. And now I just replace the hard-coded explosion 2 with the sample that we want to play. And let's log it so we can see that it matches those names. So let's do console.log sample here. Okay, so, oops. Oh, I left out the S here. Let's try it again. Okay, so we have explosion 1, explosion 2. Okay, so now I have both my sampler and my explosion. So let's map, instead of drawing our random circles for the keyboard, let's map that to our explosion. So for our first explosion, that's the Q key, so let's do 81. So that's Q. And then the second explosion is W, which is the 87 key. So now we have visuals to go along with each of our samples. So here's Q and W. And that's a little more appropriate for an explosion. And there's our keys. All right, so that is adding another type of sampler that does not pitch the samples. So if you want to have some sound effects that aren't getting pitched like they're part of a synthesizer or piano or instrument, you can use a player object instead. It is a little bit more annoying to write, as we saw, because there's not very great documentation for it, but it is possible using the Tone.Players. Okay, so I just want to go over one more thing real quick, and then I'll give you guys the rest of the class to work on your project. So I want to show you guys how to add effects, because effects are an easy way to make your project a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to go to Tone and go to the API. And if we scroll down, there's a whole section for different effects. Um, and so different effects do different things. We don't have time to go over every single one, but you can get a lot of cool stuff from these. I'm going to go with the ping pong delay, just because this one is very easy to hear. You can very easily hear what the effect is doing to the sound. Um, and so making an effect, they almost all work pretty much the same way, except they have different parameters. So let's listen to the ping pong delay here for a second. So if I run this, so if you have headphones on, that should be pretty easy to hear. It's bouncing back and forth between the right and left channels. And so that's a pretty easy effect to see that it's working and to understand what it does. And so adding an effect always kind of looks like this. The parameters might be different, but essentially what you're doing is connecting the effect to your synthesizer or your sampler. And so there's a few different ways to do that. I'll go over a couple of them. But for this one, I'm just going to copy this code. I'm not going to change any of the parameters, but to all of the effects have a different set of parameters, which you can look.
So you connect the effect to this destination, and then you connect your uh, instrument to the effect.
You can do it in multiple ways. So I'm going to show a couple different ways that you can do it. But yeah, that is one. That's how it's showed in the example, but it's not the only way that you can do it. Um, but what I was saying is in the constructor, you can see the parameters that each effect takes. So for the ping pong delay, there's a delay time. This is the time between echoes that you hear. And then the feedback range is basically how much of the delay gets added. So if you make the feedback very high, like you know, 0.9 or something like that, you'll hear a ton of feedback. If you make it very low, you'll hear less feedback. So all of the effects have different parameters. We don't have enough time to go over kind of the differences of all of them. But you can read about the parameters on the API. So if there's an effect that you like distortion or a phaser or tremolo or something like that, you can read about how they work. So yeah, let's copy this line of code and bring it over to our project. So I'm going to apply this to my sampler, and I'm just going to copy this in here. And so as Gal was asking, there's a few different ways we can do this. So let's actually let's move this down. And so we have to connect everything eventually to the output, which is our destination. So there's a couple of different ways we could do that. We can create our delay and then create our sampler and then connect them, or we can uh, connect our sampler into our delay and then that to the destination. But we can also use what's called a chain. So one way that we can do this, I'll keep my sampler connected to the destination, and then I'm just gonna create the ping pong, and then connect the sampler to the ping pong. So I'll say sampler dot connect ping pong. And actually, well, no, I have to connect both. Sorry, I can't take this one out quite yet. So I have to connect both to the destination, but I can also connect the sampler to ping pong. Okay, so now we should be able to hear the effect. So you can hear that ping pong delay where I hit the key once and then it repeats a few times. And so the two parameters for the repeat are the length of delay. So it's a quarter note now. If I make that something smaller, like an eighth note, the delay will go faster. And the second parameter is a feedback. This is from 0 to 1. So if I increase this by a lot, we're going to hear a lot more uh, instances of the delay. So if I do like 0.5, the delay lasts much longer. And those are the two parameters that determine the quality of the effect. So you probably don't want to go too high on here because then the delay will never end. I think the 0.2 is probably a good uh, value that they have in the example. So this is one way that I can do this. I can connect my sampler to the destination and then connect my ping pong to the destination and then connect my sampler to the ping pong. If I want to be a little bit more simplistic, I can chain these together. So the way that I would do that is I would get rid of each one of these two destinations. And then I would say sampler dot chain, and I would chain first the ping pong, and then to get the destination, I just take it out of the tone object. So I just say tone dot destination. So this is the same thing as to destination, as long as you can spell it correctly. So the way you write it is kind of a matter of personal preference. I kind of like writing it like this because it takes up so much less space. But using the to destination is totally valid way to do it as well. So the chain is basically just saying like we have this sampler and then we're drawing a line from the sampler to the effect, and then we're taking another line from the effect to the destination, which is our audio context, which is what plays audio out of our computer speakers. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's a lot more effects that you can play with. So you can hear examples of the effects on the Tone API website. There's a lot of cool effects like distortion and bit crusher. The phaser is a good one. Let's see if this has a sample. So you can add a lot more, different qualities to your sound by using those effects. Okay, so I think that's good for now. I'm going to save this, and that link that I already shared is going to be the same, so you can just use that link. And if you want to fork this and start from here, you can do that. If you want to start from scratch, that's fine as well. For this assignment, we really just need a website where a user can trigger sounds. They can use the mouse or the keyboard. I wrote keyboard here, but I think Janine was asking on Monday about using the mouse. So if you want to use the mouse, that's fine as well. And then some visuals. It doesn't have to be super complicated unless you want it to be. Just some visuals to kind of show us that we are, interacting with the scene. So you can see my visuals are really, really simple. I just have piano keys for each one of my samples, or these kind of like random circles and squares. Um, so for this one, for documentation, it's going to be a little bit trickier because when you post on the Open Lab, we're not going to be able to hear the sounds until we go over to P5. So if you want to, take a screenshot of the project in like a main window, let's see if I have it open somewhere. Yeah, like here. So you could take a screenshot of the window while you're interacting with it and post that on the Open Lab. And then just a link to the code because we are going to have to go to the code to actually hear the result. You could record the audio, but audio recording from the computer is actually pretty tricky, so I'm not going to take time right now to go over it. If you want to try that, you're welcome to, and you could post the recording on Open Lab as well. Um, so
Yeah, Xbox Game Bar works with the audio, right?
yes, you can record audio with the Xbox Game Bar. So if you want to try making a video of your sound project, I encourage you to do that. It's not too hard. It's just a little more complicated than obviously taking the visual. But you're welcome to try that out if you're interested in doing that. Um, but either way, just post something on the Open Lab and then submit your Open Lab link on Blackboard as usual. So I'm going to stop the recording.